Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to approach life to find out who we truly are here in the universe. Many times we find ourselves pretty much going through life as though we're in some sort of a trance. We never really take the time to do any self-inquiry to find out what those questions such as who am I and what is here to directly experience what follows these and similar questions. The result is not to go back into the trance by turning away from that essential experience, but to freshly inquire anew as thoughts or feelings of separation arise. Sometimes we become encouraged not to judge them, rather to use them as pointers toward experiencing fully the emotions they lead to, divorced from the circumstances and thoughts which gave rise to them. In essence, finding out who you are could probably sometimes be a scary process, but certainly a fulfilling one. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book Freedom and Resolve, that's finding your true home in the universe. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Gangaji. Gangaji, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. Happy to be here.
I was taking a look at what you've done here in your life, and you've had quite an extensive trip pretty much around the world when it comes to embracing who you are and how you came to discover yourself. Tell us about this.
Well, I believe that when we are born, we begin searching for who we are, and it's just part of the human journey. And, of course, we are told who we are by parents and siblings and teachers and society and religions. And we take on those different mantles and we try to be who we are told we are. And ultimately, we can't because it's all made up. It may have its purpose, certainly has many purposes, but in terms of really fulfilling our deepest desire to realize who we are, maybe even know who we are is not the correct terminology because it's deeper and closer than any knowledge that we can accumulate. And it's here. It's who we are.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did quite a bit of searching yourself, a lot with Eastern philosophy, but it was when you finally came across Sri Ramana Maharishi and Sri Punjaji that you really found a radical shift. What happened there that made things so different?
Well, when I met my teacher, Punjaji, who I called Papaji, he told me something I had never heard in all of my searching from the day I was born to that moment. He told me, in this moment, not as a dogma, not as a religion, not as a practice, just stop. Just stop your search. Be still. And, I mean, if I had been told that, I didn't get it, and I somehow got it with him. And I was able in that moment to really be still, to not be looking for my fulfillment, to not be looking for my next iteration of who I am, but just to be still and recognize what has always been here. The core of the matter, the heart of the matter. And it was a huge revelation and fulfillment in that moment. And then there were moments that followed where I would say yes, but to that, and what about, and that's just the mind activity, and it continued, and I could check in any moment what is still here, what has always been here, regardless of my age, regardless of my state of mind or my latest definition or my feeling, what is here. And I could discover it was the truth of myself. And I do discover that, and I invite others to discover that.
Now, that sounds very exciting, but sometimes I think people get very confused about what it is they're searching for here. Do you find that happen quite a bit?
Yes, I think the whole search is very confusing.
I noticed because I was looking at Zen was one of those paths that you chose, and I remember when I embarked on that particular journey, you're reading about all these mystical experiences these people had through time, and you realize, well, I have to sit here and I have to meditate day in and day out to hopefully have something like what they're describing here in these books. And I realized, years later that it really wasn't about that. That it was really about just being present and seeing things as they really are in front of you.
It's so simple then, isn't it? We make it really complex in our deciding what this must mean, and maybe the writer of those books also made it complex in the translations that we have received and the idealization that we receive. We all want to feel happy, but happiness as a state of mind comes and goes, and if we try to make it stay, we are less happy. If we, as you say, just recognize things as they are and really be still with that, not in a repressive way, but in an open way, then there is a very simple, profound discovery of who one always is. It's subtle at the beginning, but it's subtle and yet very concrete. In the middle of the night, you can discover this. In the first thing of the morning, in the middle of an argument, in the middle of a moment of bliss, there is always this presence of being that is here, that is closer than our body identity or definition, or our sexual or gender definition, or our political definition, cultural definition. All of that's on the surface. Closer in to the heart of the matter is who you are, and it's not knowable as another object of mind, but it is directly discoverable, experienceable. It's good news.
I like the way you began the chapter on boundless love, because it really describes, I think, quite a bit the paradox people tend to face. And it says here, my struggle has to do with feeling that I don't know how to live, I just exist. This is not the problem. The problem is thinking that you do know how to live and then struggling to make life match that thought. How often do we actually find ourselves engaged in that process and becoming frustrated?
Well, I think that's a constant activity of human beings, and it comes from accepting the definitions that have been given to us, the latest definitions maybe, but that's just part of a layer of definitions that started when we were born, and not being able to completely fit into them. And then we begin to idealize the perfect me. And that perfect me is the phantom, it's a fantasy, and it may serve as helping us to see where there's destructive behavior, unnecessary suffering, but it finally has to be realized as non-existent. And when the perfect me is recognized as non-existent, and there is a surrender to not knowing, there is an opening, and that opening reveals a perfection. It's not that we make perfection or we even find perfection, but all of the totality of sensations and feelings and events and thought and people and all of it, the totality of being then is discovered to be this huge, vast mystery. And we are both humbled and exalted in the same moment that we are an aspect of this mystery. And that's the beginning of really stopping trying to know what you should be or how you should live, and actually discovering who you are and how you should live, where you are.
When that happens for someone, what type of freedom, I guess, for lack of a better word, do they experience?
Well, it's an incredible event. It's sort of the culmination of this whole search. So often there's recognition. I mean, I can say from my own experience that there was a moment where I just began to laugh, and I think I even said something like, "Oh, it's me," because I have been aware, and I think we are all aware of this sense of being, but we jump up ahead of that, and and add what other people tell us or our rebellions to what other people tell us. And so it was coming home, and it was a shock, a surprise, and a recognition that, oh, this is freely here. And then as I began to explore myself in that way, I discovered that I had been seeking freedom of the body. And the body is not free. It's constrained by form and hormones and aging and biology and genes and conditions. I mean, so many prisons. Of course, the body can be tended and it can be taken care of, but if it is looked to as the vessel or as the manifestation of freedom, there's always disappointment. And the thinking mind is not free. It's conditioned. It's amazing, and we know moments of freedom in creative thinking or fresh thinking, but the habitual thinking mind is a cycle of a wheel, a hamster wheel. And events are not free. They come and we have no control over them, and they happen and then they go. Of course, there are relative freedoms, and I support and champion relative freedoms, the political freedoms, freedoms to love who we love. But finally, we don't find freedom, real freedom, in relationship we find relative freedom. And again, I want to say that's a beautiful freedom, and we should really work to keep that freedom, but it's still a freedom that's limited, and it can be taken away from us. Mm-hmm. The freedom I'm speaking of is what is inherently who you are. And so whatever the circumstances, internally or externally, that's who you are, and it's free.
It almost seems impossible at times to break away from that thought of who we are because of all the conditioning that we experience in the first 18, 20, some odd years, 30 years, it depends on the individual, of a person's life to finally go, well, now what step into this direction do I take in trying to break free from all that?
Well, I believe it's a kind of readiness. It's also a mystery. For Ramana Maharshi, you mentioned him at the beginning, who was my teacher's teacher. He was a 16-year-old boy, and he was not particularly spiritual or religious, and his father died, and it was a great shock to him, a life shock. And rather than run from that shock, he took the revolutionary approach of actually lying on the floor and experiencing what is this death, what dies and what is free of death. And he discovered that his body dies, that eventually his thoughts die. In fact, we know every night when we go to sleep, deep sleep, our thoughts die. So what is it that remains? And after experiencing some very intense fear and unknowing, he discovered the truth of life as consciousness. But that doesn't mean your life or my life, and yet your life and my life are filled with that as long as we have these life forms. So these life forms, each of us, is not separate from the greater, vast life consciousness. In fact, it's one and the same, but the life form is limited, physically, mentally, emotionally, circumstantially. And the source of the life form is endless, at least as far as we know. I'm not just speaking of life as we know it on planet Earth. I'm speaking of life that gives rise to planet Earth and the galaxy we're in and the billions of other galaxies that exist. This mystery of vastness, and we are on that. And to recognize that rather than to worship our attempts to get to be somebody we think we should be or we hope we should be, or to be running from someone we fear we should be, we are, just to take a moment, this moment, and just stop. Recognize aren't running towards something or away from something or hiding from something, fighting something. And when you let your attention fall into that vastness, there are revelations that are what you have been running for from the beginning. Whether we are just seeking to individuate, or whether we're seeking enlightenment, or whether we're seeking wisdom, clarity, peace, it's here. Right where you are, right where you started.
It seems fascinating that for many people who find themselves suffering is that they reach outside of themselves for the cure, when, as you've been saying the whole time, it's always been inside of you. But the question becomes, how do we get in touch with that?
Yes, that is the question. And there is a readiness in the mind stream, a maturity of something. I couldn't even say what, because as I was saying, Robin was 16. Sometimes it's a deathbed experience. But there's a readiness where that question even arises. So it's not something that can be forced or even taught, really. It's not that you can go out and save people by teaching them this. There is something that arises where you want to know, who am I really? Or what does that even mean, going inside? How? And so first it's to acknowledge that a question has arisen, that there is within oneself some yearning, call, that nothing will satisfy, that survival itself hasn't satisfied it. As glorious as and necessary as survival is, there's still something more that's wanted. Because there are plenty of people who survive and plus and are miserable. And there are also plenty of people who are on just the verge of non-survival and have somehow discovered. You said the cure, I would say the healing of this life experience, of this sense of aloneness or separation. And that is that question, when it arises, has within it the answer. So if we're willing to follow the question back to the yearning that gave rise to it, that's where we discover what inside means, the possibility of self-discovery.
Now, I think it's fascinating because you state that when it comes to emotions, we still live in superstitious times. And when I read that and really began thinking about it, I thought, how true that really is. Especially as a whole group, of people, you realize that you still fall into that folly, that we still need to look over our shoulders and be concerned with what may be chasing us, or, wearing the cloak so we don't allow people to see those shadow selves, as though we're supposedly inherently supposed to be flawless, when in fact the flaw is thinking that isn't a part of you, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. And the biggest superstition is around death, because, of course, our superstitions arise as some way of keeping death away, or loss, which is death of some form. And so when Ramana felt this fear of death, and when any of us feel this fear of death, which is natural to feel a fear of death, but rather than covering that and generating superstitious thinking around that, or ritual around that, just to take a moment and actually open to the fact that this form that I call me will certainly die. Today, tomorrow, 10 years, 50 years, it certainly will have to face death. And to open to that before that moment comes. Face the superstition that we shouldn't face death, that we should run from death or not speak about death or act as if death doesn't exist, which is probably the biggest superstition of all humans of whatever culture. It's pretense, but in our Western culture in particular, we act as if death doesn't exist until it's here, and then it's naturally a huge event of suffering. And so the invitation is to put aside or just suspend that superstitious thought of, if I invite death or if I face death, then I will surely perish in this moment. To face this demon. And it's a great discovery. You're not facing anything. It is the superstition itself that has kept the suffering and the fear in place. This is not a morbid invitation. I'm not inviting people to harm themselves or, to throw themselves in front of a bus. But this is the result of really the question that you were speaking of, and the questioning, inquiring mind that appears with a certain wisdom, maturity, or life experience, with enough loss or enough failure, enough success, enough gain, with the recognition that still there is something that wants to be answered by this particular lifetime. And, of course, it is our superstitions that keep us in line, keep us away from that answer. And that's the possibility. That's what I'm appearing in people's lives for. That's what my teacher appeared in my life for, was to really support me in just being still and stopping. And we even have a huge superstition about being still. We're afraid if we aren't in constant motion, mentally and physically, that we will die. We'll lose everything. And, of course, that's based on survival of the form, because we are a social species, and we were hunter-gatherers at one point, and we did have to move all the time. And it's still in there as a thought form. It's in our mind stream. So to open to that can be terrifying. Like opening to a religion, the falseness of a religion that we don't even know we practice. And we're afraid. We're afraid of hell. We're afraid of damnation. We're afraid of death. But open to that fear and discover what is here in the opening. And it's a great possibility. And it's possible for anyone who is in the least interested in it, because that interest means that the question is alive.
I have brought up on the program before that it seems the running theme of fear for a lot of us is the fear of death. But I've actually decided to challenge that, and I believe that people seem to be more afraid of being alive.
Yes.
And what has been your experience with that? Would you agree with something like that?
I think finally they're the same. I think it takes us back to the superstitious thinking. It's the way you're supposed to not let the gods see that anything good has happened to you, so it won't bother you and take it away from you. So that's the way we live life, in a kind of constrained corner, so that death won't be tempted to come get us. So even the fear of life, which is the tragedy of not finding yourself, is based somehow on the fear of death. It's like a trick of the mind to avoid death. And it's a small corner, and the possibility is to come out into the fullness of your life.
I found that funny to look at that and to really observe the fact that it's often, if you really listen to people, well, I really, I'm thinking about doing this, but I haven't done that yet. Well, why is that? Well, I'm afraid. Oh, really? Okay. Well, what evidence do you have that that's true? And start inquiring, as you have that you talk about here in your book, Freedom and Resolve, is start asking the questions when that comes up that prevents you from moving forward. And it's really fascinating. There was a wonderful movie that came out in the early 1990s called Defending Your Life. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not.
Yeah, it's Albert Brooks and Meryl Streep, and he dies in his 40s.
Yeah.
And he goes to a place called Judgment City, and basically they reflect on 9 days of his entire life to find out whether or not he's ready to move forward in the universe or whether or not he has to go back to Earth and do it again until he gets it right. And most of what they examined was the fact that you live your life in a lot of fear. Most people who live on Earth apparently do, but once you lift that veil, that dark cloud of fear, just move it away and start living, it suggested you're in for a crazy roller coaster ride. And so they examine his life, and they give him a lawyer, and they take a look at this to see whether or not he's ready to move on. And it was really quite a funny movie to realize, if we could just do that, which we can, just move forward. I mean, there's reasonable things to be, I guess, afraid of, like you don't stand in front of a cobra, for instance. That just won't turn out well. But and just the common things, maybe it's going in to ask your boss for a raise or quitting the job or starting the business or, beginning a relationship that you've always wanted to begin. And, what prevents us from doing that, thinking the whole time that we just aren't enough?
That's it. I look forward to seeing that movie again. I remember I did see it, and I just delighted in them so much. I didn't get how profound it actually is. Because it shows the human conditioning. That's the best comedy that shows the human conditioning.
Now, tell the listeners out there, from your perspective, why you wrote Freedom and Resolve. Because I know what I experienced at first. You're thinking, okay, there are going to be steps or processes, but I would have to say, in relief, that didn't occur. This was more of a reflection that really started tying and twisting your thinking a bit to make you realize you need to relax. Take it easy.
Yeah, which really is what stop means, Just take a moment, take this day, and just be willing to not know, to open. So Freedom and Resolve came out of a series of conversations from meetings I had had with people, and I knew I've read self-help books. I've benefited from self-help books, but I knew that I wasn't interested in a self-help book. It's not help. It's actually support. Because it's not going to fix you. It's just going to point you back home to where you are. And in that, there's a possibility of living a full life that is a life of discovery. And it's an adventure. And sometimes we aren't ready for an adventure. If our main concern is where the next food is coming from, that's enough adventure. But at a certain point in our lives, there is a readiness. We have enough food, or we have the shelter, and we want something more. And what we want is life. What we want is ourselves, the freshness, the openness, the recognition that it is a mystery, that it is vast, and that we are here for a short time, and we can play a role that is congruent with the vastness of the universe, rather than just hiding out. So hopefully it's not an abstract book. It's actually a book that really does invite the reader to ask the hard questions for themselves without receiving answers from anyone else. Because mostly we've lived our lives from other people's answers. And we may have gained wisdom from those other people, but we finally have to discover what cannot be taken away from us. So what happens if there's a political change, if there is a physical change or an emotional change, a relationship change? Death itself, what still remains? And I mentioned, I think, earlier that often on deathbeds, people have the experience of surrender. And there have been so many reports that I experienced it with my mother, too, who was not a spiritual or religious person, but But she recognized she was dying, and of course, prior to that, she fought the disease, but she recognized she was at the end. And she just surrendered. She opened, and it was beautiful. There was such radiance in her room, in this sick room, and we as her children benefited so profoundly because that's always what we loved. The personality had been quite difficult, but the meeting of this pure spirit or pure presence, and it resolved all the issues of my conflicts with her. So my point is that we don't have to wait for the deathbed. We can actually recognize that this life is limited, surrender to that, open to that, and then there is a limitless presence that is revealed to be here, not to be one's object, not that someone we can control it, but that it is here and it is alive. Some people would call it God. I call it life. Life is here, and life is conscious, and we are filled with life. And before we are born, life is here. After we are dead, life is here. We are of this life, and when that identity shifts to life, then there is freedom to live, and to live in a way that suits the particular form, which may be a life as a hermit. It may be a life as a social activist. It may be in relationship or out of relationship. There's no formula for that because it's coming from freedom rather than from the definitions that you have accepted or rejected and then somehow built another definition around that. So it's really to support people. That's the purpose of the book. Those people who are ready to inquire, to discover a deep and fulfilling life.
I was watching an interview some time ago with probably my favorite all-time actor, Bill Murray. And, and here's an actor that's been in a diverse realm of movies. And it was interesting because he was posed the question, in a way it was, what do you think makes great actors, including actresses, great? And he says what he believed is the ability to actually be themselves in the role that they're in. And he says, really think about it. The really good ones, they go in and they do the role, but it's really just them doing a role. They may go in and do another role and be another someone else, but it's really just them, just kind of morphing into that. And then and I thought really the most interesting thing that he said is just think about this for a minute, how hard it really is just to be yourself.
That's right, because you can't really do anything to be yourself. Oh, I love that. And I love, of course, Bill Murray's movie Groundhog Day, because that is such a teaching movie of how we repeat our same habits, hoping that this time they will get through, how we overlook what it means to just be, to be here.
Fascinating. The book is Freedom and Resolve. Our guest today, Gangaji. Is there a website people can find out more about you and your work and where you're at?
Oh, yes. I'll spell the name because sometimes people have a problem with that. It's GANGAJI.org, O-R-G. And, yes, we have an extensive website and there are online programs and then I do travel some. I just returned from the San Francisco area, and I'm going to the Southern California area. And then I go to Europe, and I'll be in Australia next year, and I'll be in Maui this winter. So I travel around, and I'm based here in Ashland, Oregon, and have some events here. And I'm just here as people can use me. Can be supported by me as my teacher supports me.
Well, I want to thank you for supporting our program by coming on and talking about your work and sharing it with those who find themselves sometimes a little twisted up by midlife, trying to figure out well, I've done everything the way I thought I was supposed to. I behaved in the way most people believed I should for acceptance, and somehow I feel like I'm standing here empty-handed and naked. What do I do next?
Well, that's a very great point to reach.
It is, because you're standing there and you're ready to start again, but this time do it on your own terms.
That's right. That's the beginning. That's the crossroads, and nothing can really happen until that moment appears.
Well, Gangaji, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Oh, Daniel, I found it really a wonderful, deep conversation.
Well, I try to go as deep as I can without drowning. I've even learned how to swim.
Yeah, that's it. Go dive deeper.
And let's not experience another Groundhog Day for the listeners out there. Thanks again for being on the program, and your website again is gangaji.org. We'll also have that on our website as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners. Be sure to also visit us at beyond50radio.com. You'll see that you can subscribe to our free weekly e-news updates. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you again for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.